Laura gazed out of the car window as the countryside passed by, a mix of dense trees and sunlight glinting off the calm waters of the distant lake. Ricardo was behind the wheel, smiling, eager to reach the house he hadn't visited since childhood. The trip had been planned for relaxation, but there was something in the atmosphere that made Laura uneasy. When they arrived at the house by Dark Lake, she couldn't shake off a chill as she looked at the dark waters. Ricardo seemed at ease, almost euphoric to see the place again. The house was old, with creaking wooden walls that bore the weight of years. Laura could feel the history embedded in those walls, as if each corner held a secret. During the first day, everything went well. They swam in the lake, had a picnic by the shore, and enjoyed the peace the place offered. However, at night, Laura began to notice something strange. The house seemed different under the moonlight. The air was heavier, and an unsettling silence hung around them. That night, Laura woke abruptly to the sound of whispers echoing in the room. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but the whispers continued, soft and persistent. She glanced to the side and realized Ricardo wasn't in bed. Heart pounding, she got up and followed the sound to the window. When she looked outside, she saw Ricardo by the lake, talking to himself. He stood at the water's edge, staring blankly at the horizon, his lips moving in incomprehensible murmurs. Laura rushed down the stairs and ran outside to find him. As she got closer, she noticed that Ricardo's eyes were glazed over, as if he were in a trance. "Ricardo," she called, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. He kept repeating disconnected words, something about the calling and the deep waters. Laura grabbed his arm and pulled him back into the house, but his body seemed to resist, as if something was trying to keep him there, at the lake's edge. Finally, she managed to bring him back to the bedroom, where he collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep as if nothing had happened. But Laura knew it hadn't been a dream. The lake, or something in it, was calling Ricardo. In the days that followed, Ricardo began to act increasingly strange. He distanced himself from her, spending hours staring at the lake, murmuring things that made no sense. Laura tried to ignore it, tried to pretend everything was fine, but the feeling that something terrible was about to happen wouldn't leave her. Determined to understand what was going on, Laura began exploring the house. In the back, she found an old cellar, filled with dusty, old objects. Among old papers and moldy books, she found a journal that seemed to belong to Ricardo's grandfather. The pages were yellowed, but the words were legible enough to tell a macabre story. The journal spoke of an old cult that gathered by Dark Lake. They believed in a water god, a powerful entity that lived in the lake's depths. To appease this god, they would sacrifice people, throwing them into the dark waters in horrific rituals. The cult members believed that those chosen by the lake were destined to become servants of this entity, trapped forever in the depths. Laura felt her blood run cold as she read. The journal mentioned that the lake still called for souls, and that those drawn to it were marked. She slammed the book shut, trying to ward off the rising fear. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. When Laura went to check on Ricardo, he was no longer in the bedroom. Panic gripped her as she ran to the lake's edge, finding him once again at the water's edge, about to step in. "Ricardo, please, no," she screamed, running to him. But he was distant, his gaze lost in the dark waters, as if something was calling him. Laura grabbed his shoulders, trying to pull him back, but he seemed to be in another world, his feet already in the lake. "The waters are calling me," he murmured. Desperate, Laura used all her strength to pull him away, but as she pulled, she felt as if something was trying to pull him back. It was as if the waters had a life of their own, an invisible force resisting her efforts. Finally, with one last effort, she managed to drag Ricardo away from the lake and back into the house. He was pale, his eyes empty, as if part of him had been left behind, in the depths. The next morning, Laura decided they couldn't stay there another day. While Ricardo was still lethargic, she began packing, trying to ignore the strange noises coming from outside. But when they tried to leave, they realized it wouldn't be that simple. The car wouldn't start, and the phone had no signal. It was as if the lake didn't want to let them go. Lara knew they had to escape, but every attempt was thwarted by some strange event: doors that locked on their own, windows that closed, and the constant feeling of being watched. Every time she looked at the lake, it seemed closer, as if it were expanding, swallowing everything around it. On the last day, when desperation had fully taken hold of Lara, the lake revealed its true nature. The waters began to churn, forming whirlpools, and voices echoed in the air, an ancient, malevolent chorus of whispers. Ricardo, in a final act of resistance, tried to run to the lake, as if it was impossible to resist the call. Lara held him with all her strength, but the waters began to rise, covering the shore, trying to drag them into the depths. The invisible weight of the lake seemed to come to life, pulling them closer and closer. With a desperate scream, Lara finally managed to pull Ricardo back into the house, locking the door behind her. She knew this battle was far from over, but she also knew that as long as she fought, there might be a chance to escape. But the lake, with its dark secrets and insatiable hunger, would not let them go so easily. Elisa parked her car in front of the imposing house by Crystal Lake, watching it for a few moments before stepping out. The property, which she had recently inherited, seemed to have been pulled from a vintage painting, with its large windows, time-worn facade, and an aura of mystery. The young writer saw the place as an opportunity to find inspiration for her next novel. The lake, mirrored and somber, reflected the cloudy autumn sky. There was something unsettling about its stillness, a sense that the waters held secrets. Elisa shrugged it off, thinking it was just the melancholic weather influencing her imagination. Inside the house, the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and mold. Shadows stretched across the hallways, as if every corner was waiting to reveal something. She began to explore the rooms, feeling a strange familiarity with the place, although she couldn't recall ever being there before. The house seemed to echo with memories from another time. In the master bedroom, she found a dusty wooden box. Inside, there were old diaries belonging to her grandmother, written in careful handwriting. Intrigued, Elisa began to read the yellowed pages. The first entries were simple accounts of everyday life, but soon they became darker. Her grandmother mentioned a presence in the lake, something the family feared but no one dared to name. Her grandmother's words resonated in her mind like a distant echo. Elisa felt a strange connection to the writings, as if she were reading her own memories. Gradually, she began to have dreams. In the first one, she saw a small girl playing by the lake, laughing as she ran along the shore. The scene seemed idyllic, but suddenly, the dream turned into a nightmare. The girl fell into the water, sinking quickly, and Elisa woke up gasping, with the feeling of cold water still present on her skin. The nights in the house began to grow unsettling. Doors she was certain she had closed would open on their own. Footsteps echoed through the hallways, even though Elisa was alone. And there was always that feeling of being watched. Sometimes she saw shadows moving in the corner of her eyes, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Determined to find out what was happening, Elisa returned to the diaries. Her grandmother mentioned the death of a child in the family, but the details were vague, as if the tragedy had been deliberately forgotten. However, as Elisa read more, memories began to flood her mind. Images of a younger sister, smiling and curious, whom she hadn't been able to remember until then. Images of playing by the lake, of childish laughter that now seemed distant and tragic. Then, one night, the whispers began. At first, they were almost imperceptible, but soon they became clear. Soft voices calling her name, always coming from the direction of the lake. Elisa found herself unable to resist the call. In the early morning, with the mist enveloping the landscape, she walked to the lake's edge, as if in a trance. The dark waters of Crystal Lake were still, reflecting the full moon above. Suddenly, something moved beneath the surface. Elisa saw the figure of a girl, her hair floating in the water like seaweed, her face pale and indistinct. A shiver ran down Elisa's spine as she recognized the figure. It was her sister, the sister she hadn't remembered until that moment. The memories finally returned, overwhelming her. Her younger sister had drowned in that lake. Elisa had been there that day, but, unable to cope with the pain, she had blocked the event from her mind. Now, the lake's waters demanded that she face this truth, or the lost memories would consume her forever. At the climax of the story, Elisa knelt by the lake, tears streaming down her face. The figure of her sister emerged from the water, extending a pale hand toward her. Elisa hesitated, but she knew she couldn't run anymore. She reached out, touching the girl's cold fingers. In that instant, a shock of memories surged through her, and the pain of loss flooded her completely. But instead of being pulled into the lake's darkness, Elisa felt a sense of peace. Her sister smiled at her one last time before disappearing into the depths, leaving only the calm surface of the lake behind. The house, which had once seemed full of shadows and secrets, was now silent. Elisa knew that she had finally made peace with the past. The tragedy that had been buried so deeply in her mind would no longer haunt her. Crystal Lake, though still mysterious, no longer had the power to imprison her. She left the house the next morning, leaving behind the lost memories, now found. The sound of the oars cutting through the calm water of Neblina Lake was almost relaxing. The group of friends, Julia, Pedro, Mariana, Lucas, and Tiago, laughed and joked as the boat approached the old, weathered dock that swayed gently with the movement of the water. The cabin they had rented stood just ahead, hidden by the thick fog that seemed to never leave the lake, even during the day. The fog was a constant presence, enveloping everything in an opaque veil that obscured vision and gave the environment a mysterious, almost supernatural feel. "This place is amazing," Julia exclaimed as she stepped out of the boat onto the creaking wood of the dock. "It's exactly what I needed to escape the city." "Yeah, totally. Completely isolated, no cell signal, and surrounded by this weird fog. Really the perfect spot to relax," Tiago joked with a sarcastic smile. "Stop being so negative, Tiago. Let's just enjoy the weekend," Pedro replied as he pulled a suitcase out of the boat. They walked up to the cabin, whose windows were fogged up from the moisture in the air. The structure was old, made of dark wood worn by time. But it had its rustic charm, perfect for a few days of rest away from everything. As night fell, the fog grew even thicker, making the atmosphere oppressive. It was as if the lake was covered by a living layer that muffled sound and turned the light of the stars into faint, indistinct glimmers. As they prepared dinner, the laughter gradually faded as they all noticed the silence around them. Not even the wind stirred the leaves of the nearby trees. "Listen," Mariana whispered, freezing in the middle of the kitchen. The group fell silent, straining their ears. A low, distant sound, like whispers, seemed to be coming from outside the cabin. It was hard to pinpoint the source. The sound was faint and constant, like voices drifting through the air. "It must be the wind," Lucas said, trying to sound confident. But they all knew it wasn't the wind. The sound seemed closer, and as the night wore on, the whispers became clearer. It was as if the fog surrounding the cabin was whispering to them, calling them outside. Tiago, the most skeptical of the group, decided to go out and investigate. With a flashlight in hand, he opened the cabin door and disappeared into the thick fog. The others waited for a few minutes, which turned into hours, but Tiago didn't return. "I think we should go look for him," Pedro suggested, his voice heavy with concern. Armed with flashlights, they stepped out of the cabin, but the fog seemed denser than ever. Every step was uncertain, and the silence was so intense that they could hear their own breathing. Suddenly, Lucas stopped, pointing toward the lake. "What's that?" In the middle of the lake, a dark figure stood on the water's surface, motionless. It looked like a person, but it didn't sink, it just floated there, like a shadow. The figure slowly turned, and the group felt a chill run down their spines. There was something profoundly wrong with that scene. "This can't be real," Mariana murmured, stepping back. Without warning, the figure dissolved into the fog, as if it had never been there. And at that moment, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening, surrounding them from all sides. Panicked, they ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind them. But the feeling of safety didn't last long. In the middle of the night, as everyone tried to sleep, more noises came from outside. Soft, almost imperceptible footsteps could be heard, and the voices, now they were closer, whispering their names. By morning, Tiago still hadn't returned, and the group was in a state of panic. They decided to explore the forest surrounding the lake, hoping to find some clue about what was happening. After hours of walking, they found an old cabin, hidden among the trees. The place was in ruins, but inside, they found something disturbing, an old, dust-covered journal. The pages were filled with accounts of people who had disappeared at Neblina Lake over the years. Apparently, those who ventured too close to the water were drawn into the fog and never seen again. There were stories of whispers, of figures walking on the water, and of an invisible force that trapped the souls of its victims in the lake, condemning them to wander eternally in the fog. "We need to get out of here now," Julia exclaimed, desperate. They returned to the cabin and began packing their things, but when they tried to leave, the fog seemed alive, surrounding them, preventing any attempt to escape. Time and space seemed distorted. The more they ran, the further they were from the exit. In a final act of desperation, the group ran toward the lake, believing that perhaps the only way to escape was to confront whatever was in the water. But as they approached the shore, the fog enveloped them completely. The sound of the whispers became deafening, and dark figures emerged around them, rising from the depths of the lake. In that moment, they realized they never should have come to Neblina Lake. The place existed in its own reality, where the laws of nature didn't apply, and death was not the end, but the beginning of a new torment.